Today we'll discuss a book from Martine Leloup, Défendre l'humanité en protégeant son patrimoine, un nouveau mandat pour les opérations de paix onusiennes, Defending Humanity by Protecting its Heritage, a new mandate of UN peace operations. It has just been published 1 week ago in Paris by Dalloz. And this book has received 2 prizes, one from Dalloz, which is a traditional prize for PhD thesis, and a prize from the National Defense Institute of Higher Education. So it has been well recognized by the academic community in France. It's a research, we'll hear more about it, which focuses on the actors of what can be seen as an important shift in international relations and international law, a shift which implies, to some extent, a new definition of what humanity is. It's a kind of political sociology of international law on this issue, and not a political theory, nor a merely legal perspective. And probably it's a way of discussing the issue which is particularly developed in France. And we'll have 2 speakers today. The first, Mathilde, the author of the book, is OxPo postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations in Oxford, and research associate to the Center for International Studies, the CERI, in Sciences Po Paris. She has written a number of articles and book chapters on this issue in addition to her book. And the discussant will be Laurence Whitehead. Laurence is an official fellow in politics at Nuffield College and a senior fellow of the college. He served as acting warden of Nuffield during the year 2005 and 2006. His research interests are the international aspects of democratization, the relationship between democratization and economic liberalism, and his main focus is on Latin America. He was also during 1 year senior proctor of the university. And among his recent books, we can quote Latin America, A New Interpretation, published by Palgrave. In addition, he's an editor of an Oxford University Press series called Studies in Democratization, and president of the Conseil Scientifique of the Institut des Amériques in Paris. So we are very pleased that he has accepted to discuss the book. I must say also personally that Laurence is one of the scholars in social sciences in Oxford who are for me the most inspiring, and I hope that life will begin again and that presential meetings will soon be possible. So the discussion will follow as this, 20 minutes for the initial presentation of the book by Mathilde, around 20 minutes also for the comment, and then an open discussion with the public, and we have altogether 90 minutes. Mathilde, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending the launch of my book. So I will start by sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, but it's not, okay.
Okay. So thank you very much for attending this session. So here is my PowerPoint. First of all, so I would like to thank the organizer of this session, especially Yves, Sintomer and Anne-Sophie Gabias at Maison Française d'Oxford, but also Florence Fauché, the director of the OxPo program, as well as Laurence Whitehead for discussing my book today. I'm very honored. So this short presentation will allow me to briefly introduce the PhD research which gave rise to this book. but also my main hypothesis, a short literature review, and also the main results, as well as the structure of the book. So this book is the result of 5 years of work from 2014 to 2019. This dissertation has been co-directed by Frédéric Ramel, professor in Sciences Po Paris, and Dacia Viro-Rose, lecturer at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge. And as Yves already said, it was awarded 2 prizes. So the starting point of this dissertation was the destruction of mausoleum and manuscript in Timbuktu, registered on the UNESCO World Heritage List, which have been destroyed by terrorist group Ansar Dine in June 2012. So here you can see the picture of this destruction. First, a mausoleum on the left, and on the right, the door of the Syria mosque. As a reaction to this very mediatized event, the UN Security Council adopted the resolution 2000 in 2013, calling on MINUSMA to protect cultural and historical sites in Mali. This resolution was regarded at that time as an historical event, because it was the first time a peace operation was charged with protecting this cultural and historical sites, so this new task. So here you can see the MINUSMA logo, as well as the training material of the peacekeeper on the right. 3 years later, the World Heritage Site of Mosul, Hatra in Iraq, and Palmyra were in turn subject to destruction by the Islamic State. So here you can see the destruction in Palmyra on the left, as well as one status in Mosul on the right. So from this momentum, from the destruction by the Islamic State, destruction of World Heritage Sites was considered by the international community as being systematic. And the example of MINUSMA became at that time no more a punctual event, but an international symbol, because of a fervent advocacy of UNESCO, which wanted at that time to systematize the protection of cultural heritage in future peace operations. So my main hypothesis in this work was to say that if the example of the protection of cultural heritage by the MINUSMA became an international symbol, it is because it embodies humanity, a notion that is as complex as it is appealing to international organization. Humanity is traditionally understood in international law on the basis of what threatens it, its enemy, and what it possesses, a common heritage. Thus, the fact that MINUSMA intervened following the attack of a terrorist group against the Humanity World Heritage Sites seemed to make it an ideal example of the defense of humanity in the face of barbarism. In order to give shape to this agonistic narrative scheme, certain actors, especially the UNESCO, its Director General, and some of its member states, like France and Italy, proceed in 3 stages. A first stage is criminalizing those guilty of the attack, the terrorist group. A second stage, recognizing the victimization of the population who suffered directly from the cultural heritage destruction. And also a final stage of heroizing the defender of this World Heritage Sites, namely the UNESCO and its allies. This triptych was born out of the observation that the crisis situation between 2012 and 2015, usually called by the actor of the UN as a momentum, during which many World Heritage Sites were destroyed, is similar to the atmosphere of moral panic and moral euphoria described by Matthew Flinders and Matthew Wood. To these 2 authors, moral panic allows the emergence of a folk devil, which is an agent of social concern that is feared by society due to the presumed moral deviancy of his behavior, and moral euphoria, which lead, on the contrary, to the emergence of a folk hero, that is to say, an agent of social concern that is loved and held in awe by society due to the presumed moral fortitude of his behavior. I noticed that this designation process, by opposing the charismatic figure of criminal on one side and heroes on the other side, contribute to a more general logic of politicization. But, and this is really the puzzle of this book, this politicization process paradoxically can appear as depoliticization. And I think this quote of Flinders and Wood can really enlighten the reason why it can be so at the same time politicized and appears as depoliticized. I will quote them. Moral panic serves to politicize certain issues in an explosive manner, while at the same time tending to depoliticize those issues by focusing attention on specific folk devils alongside a grossly simplified narrative that posits a simple solution to a complex problem. So here, in order to speak about politicization, I use Hegel and Duchesne, French author, but also the agonism of Chantal Mouffe. Indeed, in the case of the UN and the integration of cultural heritage within the mandate of MINUSMA, the context of the momentum, so the crisis, allowed on the one end the defensor of a systematic integration of cultural heritage protection within the mandate of future peace operation by politicizing this protection. This advocacy, however, did not question the functionalist view of international organization because this protection was made in the name of humanity, which is a global norm and a global, which is very consensual. So here, my book is rooted into the political science discipline, and more particularly the international relation studies. But I also, because I think cultural heritage is a very singular issue, I also borrowed from the critical heritage study literature. This is why this dissertation, because of my co-direction, was at the same time in line with the work of the research group on multilateral action in France, funded by the CNRS, but also the Cambridge Heritage Research Center, thanks to Dacia Viroros. And I was welcome in this center as a visiting researcher between April and June 2017. So just to give you an idea of the literature review at the beginning of my work in October 2014, there was only one article at that time dealing with the protection of cultural heritage by UN peace operation, a single one written by Sigrid von der Auwera, written in 2010. And this article advocated for the integration broadly of a cultural dimension in the mandate of UN peace operation. Apart from this article, there were also two types of literature dealing marginally with this question. The literature from law and archaeology dealing with cultural heritage and the military, but which rarely mentioned the case of UN peace operation in itself. And the literature from political science dealing with UN peace operation, but which made only a very few mention to the case of cultural heritage protection. So my goal at that time was to create a dialogue between these two literature, but also more generally to exceed them in order to draw more general conclusion on the functioning of international organization, and especially on this political depoliticization process. This dissertation was based on three types of source: participant observations, semi-directive interviews, and archival analysis. So the first participant observation has been conducted in the UNESCO Secretariat in Paris, 3 months as an intern in the Department of Public Information, and then 7 months as a consultant in the Office of the Director General. I also spent then 3 months in the UN Department of Peace Operation in the Civil Affairs team. And then I completed this participant observation with 80 interviews conducted with the UNESCO and the UN official within the secretariats, but also in the field, notably in Mali, Iraq, and Syria, but also with members, for example, of other organizations, NATO, OCHA, UNDP, but also with national army, especially the French and the American one. And I also conducted archival analysis at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris and at the UN headquarters in New York. So here are the main results of my book based on these three types of source. So these three results concern three different levels: an empirical level, a theoretical level, and a conceptual level. So the first conclusion here on the left is addressed to the literature on peacekeeping and concern the advantage for UN peace operation to protect cultural heritage sites. So thanks to semi-directive interviews by the UN Department of Peace Operation and the Department of Operational Support Staff, I discovered that the integration of cultural heritage protection within the mandate of MINUSMA was indeed less a reaction to the attack perpetrated by Ansar Dine in June 2012 than a response to the vandalism act perpetrated by UN Blue Helmets themselves in Western Sahara. So here are the pictures of this graffiti in 2008. This incident triggered the integration of the category of cultural and historical resource in the UN environmental policy, which is the first internal document that requests UN mission to reduce their environmental footprint, including on cultural and historical sites. So with this first conclusion, I demonstrated that change in international organization and in peace operation were more reactive than proactive. Then, thanks to archival research, I also discovered that MINUSMA was not the only case of protection of cultural heritage. So here you can see on the map all the peace operations that took cultural heritage into account before and at the same time as MINUSMA. So what I proposed in my research was two types of decentering. The first type of decentering is an historical one. This historical decentering goal is to reveal the existence of other peace operations that took cultural heritage before MINUSMA. So as you can see on the map, there are, for example, the mission in Cyprus, the mission in Cambodia, in Kosovo, and in Lebanon. Secondly, I proposed a functional decentering by disclosing a distinction between the former and the contemporary peace operation regarding their protection of cultural heritage. What I tried to demonstrate in my chapter 2 and chapter 3 was that the former peace operation like Cyprus, Cambodia, and Kosovo regarded cultural heritage protection as a strategic issue, whereas contemporary peace operations that take cultural heritage as part of the UN environmental policy regard it as a logistical issue. And this has direct consequence on the way cultural heritage is protected. For former peace operation, if I take the operation in Cyprus, for example, which started in the 70s, taking into account the protection of a World Heritage Site was at that time amounting to taking side within the conflict for one of the belligerents. Whereas now in contemporary peace operations, which are intervening in asymmetric conflict, the protection of World Heritage Sites means protecting the heritage of local population in front of terrorist group, and in this sense, to win hearts and minds of local population. So this is part of a new strategy. The second conclusion here in the middle is that it concerns international relations and political sociology literature. The goal here, with thanks to my participant observation, was to demonstrate that the politicization, depoliticization process was, first of all, not a sequential, but a simultaneous phenomena into the international organization organs, that in the frame of this international organization, this process was not the result, and at least not only the result of member state action, but also of the member of the UN staff. And furthermore, that while it is true that international organizations on a daily basis would use depoliticization, at the same time, they could become highly politicized. For example, during the campaign of Irina Bokova for the position of UN Secretary General. This conclusion challenged the assumption of an apolitical international sphere opposed to a domestic political order and plead for bridging international relations with political and political sociology closer. A third conclusion on the right deals with political science more generally and has to do with the process of agonism. So here, my main demonstration, and it leads to the very structure of the book, was that in order to claim the mantle of defender of humanity, UNESCO, Director General, and member states identified the perpetrator of the attacks, identified the victim, and ultimately this allowed them to emerge as heroes. This threefold process here reveal a use of the notion of humanity in the center here of my picture, use of the notion of humanity for political purpose. It provides them, so the Director General of UNESCO, for example, but also France, the opportunity to reposition themselves within the hierarchy of multilateralism, while at the same time cloaking all their action under the enchanted veil of apoliticism, as described by Jacques Lagroix. So this threefold process gave rise to the three parts of my book that I will very briefly introduce. So the first part has to do with criminalization, and this is chapter 1. In each of the parts, the first chapter is more theoretical than the two other ones, which are more empirical. So the first part, dealing with criminalization, deal with the way UNESCO staff carried out the criminalization process of those guilty of the attack on mausoleum and manuscript of Timbuktu. So in order to integrate the protection of cultural heritage within the mandate of MINUSMA, and more generally in the field of competence of the UN Security Council, they used a criminalization process very visible in the preamble of this resolution. But very paradoxically, this does not trigger a process of safeguarding of cultural sites on the ground. That is to say, there were no UN blue helmets posted right behind the site to protect them, but only to respect them. That is to say, to not increase the environmental footprint of UN peace operation. These two processes I call patrimonialization and environmentalization. In the second part, it has to do with the victimization of the population suffering from the destruction of heritage sites. Through the communication campaign Unite for Heritage and through the discourse of Irina Bokova, UNESCO transformed cultural heritage protection into a security and a humanitarian issue. To do it, they put it a face on the victim of cultural heritage destruction by using and illustrating the concept of cultural cleansing. This concept of cultural cleansing creates a link between heritage destruction and population persecution. And you can see here on the picture, the link between the two with the picture. This allowed the UNESCO to engage into crisis management. But, however, for the other UN actor, like the humanitarian, for example, or the UN peacekeeper, UNESCO was not really acknowledged as a humanitarian actor because they would prioritize the protection of human life among other action like the protection of cultural property. And the third part has to do with errorization. And I demonstrate that the crisis situation encountered by UNESCO at the time of this crisis allowed this specialized agency of the UN to be acknowledged. Sorry, I will start again. I demonstrate that this crisis situation in 2012-2015 allows the protection of cultural heritage to be acknowledged as a need for humanity. Just as, for example, health for the World Health Organization, or just as environment for the UN Environmental Program, for example. It allowed UNESCO to be acknowledged officially as a humanitarian actor in 2016 during the World Humanitarian Summit, but also allowed, for example, Italy, as I demonstrate in my chapter 4, to be acknowledged and to be to facilitate for Italy a seat of non-permanent at the UN Security Council, but even more importantly, it allows the Director General of UNESCO to be to appear as a credible candidate to succeed Ban Ki-moon at the position of UN Secretary General. So here is the very structure of the book, and we can discuss it further later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. Laurence, I give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think everybody who's listened to the presentation will already have grasped that this is a very solid and substantial piece of work. It's an original study on a matter of both of contemporary relevance and also of theoretical and analytical importance, both for international relations and in fact for other questions about social theory as well. It draws on a wide range of literatures and carefully fits them all together into a well-structured argument that is clearly laid out and that advances steadily, as you've just seen with this statement about the 9 chapters. They're very carefully organized to advance steadily across a wide range. And as you also heard, it's the product of some 5 years of intensive study, including some important episodes of participant observation. And Mathilde has an interesting discussion both about the procedures she followed in participant observation and about the tensions and challenges that arise from trying to do that when you're so much in the center of, you're in a sense at the heart of what's going on, which helps you understand how it really works. But at the same time, you're in the process of becoming a participant, and that can introduce tensions, which I think she seems to have handled very well. It is a big study. It's 700 pages, this book. And so it's a major investment of her time, and it's a major effort on our part to take it all on board. I think the half-hour presentation we've just had is a very good guide to help people find their way through it. When I agreed to serve as a commentator, I thought this is not my field, and that I was not an expert, and there are probably rather few experts in the field, in fact. So I would make a stab, but I wouldn't really expect to have a great deal that I could build on. However, as I progressed through the book, I was pleased to encounter quite a number of familiar figures whose ideas were well explained and appropriately used. She starts off with Matt Flinders, our friend from Sheffield University, for example, on the idea of moral panics, which she uses well. She brings in, as you see, Chantal Mouffe and her ideas about agonistic politics. And I was interested, although she hasn't mentioned it, that she also brought in an old friend of mine, Juan Martinez Allier, on the environmentalism of the poor, which is relevant to the whole question of the protection of the environment as well as the physical monuments. And there are also all the big names in international relations theory are there, but in addition, leading sociologists are given an airing. Norbert Elias gets a fair amount of attention. Emil Durkheim comes in a useful way. Levi-Strauss. In addition to the legal and the sociological and the international relations scholarship, she also had to have firm control over the more technical issues, both the legal language used when formulating resolutions, when negotiating the publication of UNESCO and UN documents and so forth. And she's really very instructive and insightful about the terminology and about the, as you might say, specialized meanings of some of the language that is employed in these resolutions and what really stands behind them. That's all carefully handled by someone who I suppose has had to chart her way through the technicalities as not just as an outside observer, but in interaction and participation, seeing these things from the inside. I expected the thesis to be all about the Timbuktu mausoleum issue, which, as you heard, was destroyed in 2012 and restored by UNESCO in 2015. While that aspect is indeed there and is carefully reconstructed and presented as the exemplary success story that UNESCO claimed because it needed to improve its standing in the UN system, in fact, in particular in the first 3 chapters, Mathilde also provides a comparative analysis of a number of earlier crucial episodes, as she mentioned, in Cyprus, in Cambodia, in Kosovo, in Congo, in Aleppo, and indeed the important precedent in Sahara Oriental, Western Sahara, which in a sense precipitated the whole UNESCO shift in stance, and some with Bamiyan in Afghanistan as well. This first third of the book I felt was successful in framing the wider debate on the preservation of World Heritage sites and on their protection from assault by the enemies of humanity. Among the issues that emerge are the need to go beyond mere physical monument protection to consider the surrounding environment, the physical environment as well as the, and the relationship of the monuments to the populations that maybe depend on them, live close to them, are interconnected. It's particularly telling, I think, the contrast between the success story of Timbuktu, where actually it was only the mausoleums in Timbuktu that were destroyed, and the people of the city of Timbuktu benefit from having them reconstituted and protected. And the case of Aleppo, where in many ways the destruction of a city of 2 million people is a much more terrible and overwhelming challenge, in which you have to say, you know, is it the destruction of buildings that you care most about here, or is the greatest shock to humanity the destruction of a huge, prosperous and culturally, historically important city and population there? Well, Mathilde was privileged to observe from close up and to participate in UNESCO efforts to update its communications and its messaging after 2012, and to reposition itself. We learned quite a bit about the bureaucratic politics and the strategic positioning followed inside the UNESCO and within different parts of UNESCO, and also between UNESCO and other parts of the United Nations system between 2012 and 2017. And it has a relationship with MINUSMA in Mali, which is quite delicate and complicated, where she records the internal tensions between, for example, military officials with one set of priorities, archaeological advisors with another, UN development agents, civilian development agents with a third. It seems clear that a very powerful and emotive use of symbolic capital was needed to paper over these internal tensions and to rationalize the repositioning of the whole bureaucracy in order to highlight an idealized image of humanity and to demonize those identified as the enemies of humanity. One delicate issue that emerges a little quietly, I think it's difficult to be too explicit about this, but I'd like, if possible, for Mathilde to just address it briefly in the next round, in some cases, it seems possible, and you do really hint at this, that UNESCO's decision to consecrate a site as of outstanding humanitarian importance can actually attract the attention of the enemies of humanity and can lead to spectacular acts of destruction that might not otherwise have occurred. I'm putting that perhaps a bit too strongly. I know the evidence on that is ambiguous. It's, you know, concerns the case of Bamijan and includes the evidence from the Timbuktu trial and so on. I don't think it's a clear-cut case, and she's right to be cautious, but I do think it's worth bringing it out because of perverse incentive being created by some of this, we need to realize what it is. Now, there are 1,121 World Heritage Sites in 167 countries, and some of these, such as the Florida Everglades or the Galapagos Islands, are just natural assets which are only under environmental threat. But most of them are human constructions of great rarity and cultural significance. Of the 1,121 in total, 53 are currently classified as in danger. 17 of them are in danger from natural sources, and 36 are in danger as cultural targets. And if we look at the ones that are in danger as cultural targets, it's interesting to see 6 of them are in Syria, 5 of them are in Libya, 4 in Iraq, 3 in Mali, 3 in Palestine, and so forth. It's also important to say that among World Heritage Sites under threat, there are some which have been declassified. They're no longer patrimony of humanity because they've been destroyed. And that, I think, includes the Circle of Timbuktu, but I will defer to Mathilde on that. At any rate, this is the background context for the last part of the book, which I want to concentrate on a little bit more. Chapter 8 focuses on the UN Security Council and brings out the role of France as the penholder for Francophone Africa. This is really quite an important aspect of the story, I think, bearing in mind that the UNESCO headquarters are located in Paris, that there are 2,000 people employed in Paris by UNESCO, if I have it right, and that France has troops stationed not only with MINUSMA in Mali, but actually across most Saharan, various of the Francophone Saharan nations, and most notably, as you will know from the news of the last couple of weeks, in the Central African Republic, which indeed supplies a good deal of the casque bleu troops. These are the troops that are supposed to be defending humanity, although, as is recognized at some point in Mathilde's text, there was a great deal of unease about the true behavior of those troops in the places that they may be stationed. So the role of France in all this is important, but I don't want to be giving the impression that I'm just picking on France here. I think there's an issue about the Security Council as a whole, in which within France, within the Security Council, France is conceded, as it were, a good deal of leeway, and it's the penholder, and it has all kinds of influence over UN policies in its zone of interest. And in return for that, the other members of the council, of the permanent members of the Security Council, get their privileged positions as well. The UK, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, the US in relation to Israel, and needless to say, China in relation to the Uyghurs, or Russia in relation to Chechnya. So there is an issue which is not high tone good of humanity, but much more sordid realpolitik, which needs to be, which comes out in this chapter, but which needs to be given some attention. Focusing in on France for a moment, it does seem to me that despite the success which they have, or which is recorded in Timbuktu, the broader effort to present Paris as the champion of humanitarian intervention and as the protector of world culture is actually rather insecure at present. I mentioned the problem of the Central African Republic, we might go into that, but let me take another example. The second largest grouping of sites at risk, cultural sites at risk, is in Libya. Now it was Britain and Britain and France who took the lead in what was done in Libya in 2011. Then the justification was the protection of threatened population from genocide rather than protection of highly valued patrimony. But for example, one of the sites at risk in Libya is the old city of Tripoli, in the center of Tripoli. You probably noticed that last year, General Hatra and his forces, which are in fact armed and supported from Paris, devoted a lot of effort, not only from Paris, but including from Paris, devoted a lot of effort to trying to conquer Tripoli at a time when very little concern was being shown as the Haftar forces bombarded the capital and attacked the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. There was no evidence that I could see that efforts were being made by those who were supporting Haftar to restrain him from damaging the patrimony of humanity in Libya. That's just one example of that we might want to discuss a little bit more. And it's of course a contemporary issue beyond when Mathilde was writing about, but it highlights the truth, which is at the beginning of her book, that you can tell a very attractive narrative and you can gather a great deal of political capital by dividing the world into the defenders of humanity and the unspeakable enemies of humanity. But then there is a problem whether you're willing to act in a consistent and systematic way to live up to the expectations that that discourse creates. And that's an extremely difficult thing to do, so it's tempting to parcel it out and say, well, that's for UNESCO, and so long as UNESCO is dealing with that, then the rest of us can get on with the regular politics that concerns us, which may be much more to do with migration of unwanted people fleeing countries we've invaded and so forth. And it also still, as the last chapter of her thesis says, brings us to a problem with UNESCO itself. Because on the one hand, it is true that UNESCO reorganized and had, it's important to know the reasons which are well described in the book, why UNESCO was under a lot of pressure. And that after all, the United States had abandoned, had withdrawn from UNESCO because of its identification with, because Palestine was admitted as a full member state in 2011 and so forth. So there were a whole series of issues that UNESCO was under pressure about, and the United Nations in general has been under pressure over the last few years. And with the UN system, the different UN agencies are all competing both for international attention and for resources that are scarce. And UNESCO was not, on the face of it, a very strong contender in that competition. It was a vulnerable part of the system until by adopting a more centralized strategy, by repackaging its public relations or its communication system, by highlighting the whole theme of victimization and heroization. And by declaring, I think with good reason, but anyway, declaring a success, which was supposed to be a model success in Mali, the UNESCO was also serving a very important bureaucratic political necessity. And as it was succeeding in doing this, it was enhancing the standing of its Secretary General. And the last chapter then is very interesting because the Secretary General of the UNESCO then competes to be the Secretary General of the United Nations, and for a while looks like the leading candidate to become the Secretary General of the United Nations. But there is a huge tension here between electoral politics and the electoral cycle and so on, and this is nicely brought out in Mathilde's last chapter, and the kind of campaigning that involves, and the emphasis on moral purity, on humanity as a whole, and on impartiality and depoliticization of the institution. I think those are very sharp issues that come to the fore towards the end of the book. And I think they're going to carry on being extremely sensitive and delicate issues as the UN continues to be under a lot of pressure, and as sites of huge value to humanity continue to be caught up in the, if anything, deepening conflicts that we're seeing in the world geopolitical system. So the book is very timely, it's very enlightening on these questions, it's cautious, and my comments are intended to slightly draw out the more explicitly political implications, because I think going forward people will need what you've discovered, but will also want to build on it to address the kind of foreseeable conflicts and divisions of opinion that may well lie before us.
Thank you, Laurence. Mathilde, you want to briefly answer some of the issues which were raised?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Whitehead, for your constructive remark. I'm really honored by your reading of my book. So yeah, in order to answer some of your question, indeed, I wanted to highlight from the very beginning of my introduction, the fact that the World Heritage Registration can be a very good tool, but it can also endanger some sites. And this is also a point made by Dario Gamboni, for example, which is why I use his quote at the very beginning of the introduction, and I can quote this researcher. To him, the World Heritage label can, I think it might be the quote, perhaps I get it wrong, but the World Heritage label intended as a shield may instead act as a target. And I think this is a very strong issue because, of course, it was very difficult for some of the UNESCO staff I interviewed during my fieldwork to say that, because of course they are good intended, they want to protect World Heritage Site, but at some point during this momentum, they became aware that it could be also a signal and it can endanger the sites, the Timbuktu, but also the sites in Syria, in Iraq, for example. So I think this is a very important issue, and also that UNESCO, but also the UN, have to be conscious about this issue. And I think it's not only the World Heritage logo, in fact, it's also, for example, the logo, the blue shield of the 2054 convention. And this issue has also been raised when I was working for UNESCO several times during the committee, for example, because it's also an issue, I think. And yes, regarding the declassification of registered site that has been destroyed, of course it can happen, but there are also interesting examples, like the case of Bamiyan, for example, which has been registered right after the destruction of the Buddhas. And I think this is very interesting because this registration shows us a new form of heritageization. That is to say, the acknowledgement of heritage no more as a monument, monumental, etc., but also as an act of violence, as a proof of an act of violence in order to keep memory of this tragedy. And I think it's also a very interesting issue to be thinking, that we can also think about. Yes, indeed, in the chapter 8, I really wanted to highlight the, I would say, real politics, or some internationalists would say the realist view of international relations, because at some point when you are working on international organization for so long, and that you have been also working for them with participant observation, you also see the Secretariat and the member state as a different part of the international organization. And it's very important also to acknowledge that member states still plays a very big role into this international organization. And in a recent article I write for the journal Negotiation, I went more deeply into the process of adoption of the resolution 2000, which was the resolution that launched MINUSMA in Mali. And for me, it was very interesting to see the opposition between the P3, that is to say, France, UK, and the US, which really wanted to introduce cultural heritage protection within the resolution as a humanitarian security issue, and the opposition on the other side of Russia, which would not oppose to the integration of this new task as such, because Russia has been engaged to protect, for example, the Syrian and Iraqi cultural goods against illicit trafficking. But it was more because this task, the protection of cultural heritage, was really an embodiment of the multiplication of tasks within the mandate of new multidimensional operation. And also because it was a task that was carried out, at least theoretically by MINUSMA, under the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. That is to say, theoretically, UN Blue Helmets were authorized to use force in order to protect the cultural heritage sites. And for Russia, it was really an issue, a concern. So at the end, what is also very interesting is to see that in the different drafts of the resolution, at the end, you have a very prudent wording chosen by France in order to have this resolution adopted. But it's also very important to not forget the strong opposition between states within these intergovernmental bodies of the international organization. And another, it's many reflections, but it was also as an answer to your remark, just about the case of Tripoli and the role of France and the UK. What was very political to me, and this is where the narrative also intervened, is that in the UNESCO Director General discourse, for example, after the destruction of sites, the distinction between collateral damage and intended damage is not on the extent of the destruction or the intention. It's really the nature of the actor. That is to say, for example, the destruction in Iraq, Syria, and Mali would be, of course, intended destruction because it was a terrorist group. But at the same period, we have also the destruction in Yemen made by Saudi Arabia. And at that time, even if it was intentional, nobody knows, it was considered as collateral damage. And I think the choice of terminology here is very political. And it's very important also to highlight this very political process within international organization, even if it seems from the outside very consensual and very depoliticized. On the UNESCO and UN system under pressure, yeah, of course, and this is also what I wanted to highlight in my chapter 9, that is to say that, of course, we can read the multiplication of project, program, communication campaign made by UNESCO during this momentum as, of course, the mirror of this application of the UNESCO Director General for the position of Secretary General. But at the same time, it also allowed UNESCO to acquire another status in the multilateral system. That is to say, it has been acknowledged officially as a humanitarian actor and no more as a development actor. That is to say, its crisis management mandate was acknowledged at some point. And I think it's very important to highlight it. I think I'm gonna hand it because I've talked a lot. So thank you very much for your comments again. And I'm happy to answer the question of the.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. We can now open the floor to the general discussion. I would propose everybody who can do it to open the camera so that we have a more lively discussion. You can either directly raise your question with your microphone. I think this is the easiest way. If you wish so, you can also write something in the chat and I will raise a question for you. But we're not that many, and I think that we can do it to accept questions directly. So please, who want to take the floor? No question?
Isn't there a hand raised by Bija?
Ah, good that you see it. I don't see it. I don't know why, but please.
Oh, no, sorry. No, my mistake. No.
I mean, perhaps I can raise one question, Mathilde. You have made, say, a micro history of this problem, focusing on a couple of years and a couple of actors. It's like a close-up. Would you accept also to put this micro history within a longer historical traveling? How can you explain that Western countries such as France, the US, or the UK, which have made in the past cultural cleansing a lot, now are those who want to defend the idea of cultural heritage of the humanity, although in a very selective way? Both you and Laurence have perfectly explained this, but still, how can you explain this change? Is it just that we are less barbarian as 1 century or 50 years ago, or how could you explain this?
So by cultural cleansing, I think you mean during, for example, colonial war, right?
Well, not only. I mean, the Brits have destroyed the old Mughal Delhi, Brits and French, the old Summer School Palace in Beijing, Italians, a lot of cities in Libya. I mean, it was just normal to do it 1 century ago. And now the same nations say that they want to defend the heritage of mankind.
Yeah.
Why is it?
Yeah.
Is it only, can you explain this only with the action of some actors? At some moment, the president of UNESCO want to become the leading figure of national nations or United National Nations, or do you have to put in the panorama a broader historical view?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I think I focused on this couple of years in part 3 because it was, I really wanted to focus on the example of the integration of cultural heritage within the mandate of UN peace operation, and I didn't want to go too broad. It was already a very, very big dissertation, and it's also a very big book, so I didn't want to be too broad. But I think what is very interesting with cultural heritage in armed conflict, and Dacia Virorose also showed it very interestingly, there is this game of the belligerent, of heroizing the self by criminalizing the other. And what is very interesting is that UNESCO and the UN does that as a rhetoric, but also the belligerent, like national state, like France, UK, the US, Saudi Arabia, but also other states. And I think it's really this issue of showing the other that you are the defender of humanity. And if you see in the archive, and that's why I really wanted to highlight it in my first part, which is mostly historical, in the case of Cyprus, in the case of Kosovo, in the case of Cambodia, it was to show that each of the belligerent in its own rhetoric want to show that he is the hero because he defends the heritage of humanity, be it the world heritage, be it only the heritage of one belligerent in the conflict, and he defends its heritage of humanity in front of the barbarians. And in the archives, you can really see all this game of criminalization, heroization, victimization. And this is very interesting to my opinion. And I think this is why cultural heritage in conflict is so singular. It's because it's so symbolic that it helps the belligerent to show that they are on the right side, you know. So I think we can use this theory of criminalization and victimization, heroization, and we can apply it to basically all kinds of conflict, including cultural heritage. And I think most part of conflict include cultural heritage destruction, but they are not sometimes World Heritage sites, so we don't hear about these sites, or just object, artifacts, etc. So I think, yes, we could use this theory very more broadly. Exactly. And in the case of France, UK, and the US, there is also a process of showing that they learned the lessons. Because if you see the US, which is now the army which has the, I mean, they have a very good training on cultural property protection, and they are the most advanced as national states to protect cultural heritage in conflict. It is also because in Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc., they have made big mistakes. So the goal now is to show that they learned the lesson, and there is this very big process of lessons learned in national army.
Thank you very much. Frédéric Rosen has a question. So please, Frédéric. Laurence, if you want to get into the discussion at any time, please do it. So, Frédéric? We don't hear you. You should activate your microphone.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, but I don't have an image. I can start that here, so I have to do without, yeah. This is Frédéric Rosen from Copenhagen. Congratulations, Mathilde, with your fascinating book, which I look very much forward to get hold of. And thanks also for the good presentations. And I think that we had some conversation about some of these topics before, and I think that this idea of bringing this whole discussion of cultural heritage into the kind of a political sociology framework and looking at how it works in international relations and how it produces new ways to interact and make politics across organizations and nations are not only refreshing, but really important to understand what is actually going on this complex area at the moment. And so I have one kind of very concrete question for you and one more general. I mean, the starting point, as you also pointed, of many of those institutional processes on the international level really kicked off with Resolution 2100. And the birth of that resolution, and namely the cultural heritage protection element of that, is really interesting, and an account that I have of it from some of the French diplomats that drafted that resolution was that France did not push cultural heritage protected language into that instrument to add another element to UN peacekeeping. So they did it in order to support the International Criminal Court in their investigation and make sure that the office of the prosecutor and the forensic team had security coverage when they were moving around on the ground in Mali. And then afterwards, I mean, there was an enormous push, not least from UNESCO and the broader advocacy community, in order to kind of cast or recast these words as a new dimension of UN peacekeeping, and then it kind of took off and again got its own life, I would say. And also this narrative about that UN authorized the use of force in order to protect sites. I don't think that was intentions behind the drafters. I mean, the way that these Security Council resolutions sometimes are written is very chaotic and not always so thought through. And I remember I had a conversation with the legats in the UN headquarters shortly after that resolution was adopted, where they were like, yes, of course they can use force in order to protect cultural heritage. And I said to them, well, this is very new. So we have seen this in very few missions, and very few states actually have a tradition of using culture or armed force in order to protect cultural heritage. I mean, Denmark being one exception on the Balkans. So there's an interesting story about a lot of kind of confusion and I would also say misinterpretation and a new meanings ascription to the life of the cultural heritage protection element in Resolution 2100. And as you also so nicely described, is that we have kind of a snowball thing going on, and UNESCO also really capitalized on Resolution 2100 in order to show their relevance in the humanitarian field. And the question is also how much this was actually UNESCO, or whether it was Irina Bokova who actually did that on her own. And I think it was the latter. I think it was very much a project of her aspirations to become the next SG for United Nations. And I think that may also be demonstrated by the fact that I think that we see very little support from UNESCO member states to embrace a UNESCO crisis management mandate. So when you say that this mandate has kind of been consolidated over the last half a decade, I would like to hear you expand a little bit about that, because as I see it, UNESCO still only have 2 persons, employed in headquarters to take care of this crisis management portfolio. So actually, exactly how much has UNESCO actually entered this field? All right, I'll stop here. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Frederic. Mathilde, Laurence, do you want to react now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Frederic, for your remark. So yes, it's very interesting. And in fact, in the Resolution 2100, what I think was very interesting was the 2 different references to cultural heritage within the resolution, because in fact the mention to ICC was made in the preamble as condemnation of cultural heritage destruction on the same along, for example, other crimes and human rights attacks. And there is also this para under the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And it's also very interesting. And what I tried to show also in the book was the difference between the resolution under this Chapter 7, which theoretically could authorize use of force, and the reality on the ground, because in fact there's never been UN Blue Helmet protecting cultural heritage sites in Timbuktu. And I saw some picture in the media showing UN Blue Helmet in front of mosques or mausoleum, but in fact, the main task was carried out by the civilian component and the unit environment and culture. So it was mainly quick impact projects that were not that mediatized, that are not that symbolic, but that in fact are very important also on the ground, just to recreate social cohesion. But as they are not that symbolic, we have no, I mean, the media won't speak about that. So there is also this institutional translation that is also very, very interesting. And regarding the snowball effect, of course, and I think this is one of the main difficulty I encountered in my chapter 9, it was that, yes, I had all this interview with UN staff, UNESCO staff, and all these people were like trying to explain me that this application of Irina Bokova was so important and that it was very enlightening on this context, on the integration of cultural heritage, etc. But at the same time, it was impossible to measure it. That is to say, it's impossible to measure even for UNESCO staff. Even if they are really honest, it's very difficult to say, okay, this action was intended for Irina Bokova or it was intended for UNESCO. And most of the time it benefits both. And I think this is why it's not a moral condemnation. It's just a description, a sociological description and ethnographic description for my part, with no moral judgment, I think. Because of course it benefits UNESCO and now it is acknowledged as a humanitarian actor, but of course, as you said, there is this unit preparedness and response at UNESCO, and from what I know, there are very few people, but the main change is that now they have a strategy, and this strategy allows UNESCO staff to have a guideline in crisis management. But what I want to research on for the moment and for my future research would be this strategy of crisis management, and see if it was just a punctual context and a punctual event, or if it will change completely the work of this organization. I think it's a very interesting topic. So thank you, Frederick.
I don't see any other question.
I think there was Eva Portel.
Okay, then Eva. Sorry, yes. I didn't see it.
That's okay, because I put the sentence in my head and then I changed my mind, but I'll ask it anyway. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. And my question, you actually formulated in your last sentence, Mathilde. It was, how is UNESCO riding on the process they created a few years ago? So do they have a strategy? Well, apparently it's still a question that sorry, I can't say it. That is not answered yet. Yeah, but that's how I put it. And I was wondering, how do you analyze UNESCO position on new recent conflicts such as Nagorno-Karabakh and Ethiopia? Sorry. Ethiopia, and I was also wondering if the impulse we can see on the national armies, such as France with the Delpat or the UK CPP unit, or even in the US, is it like a spillover effect of the impulse UNESCO started a few years ago, and now they're, I don't know if we can say that, but they're transferred their competences and the lessons and all the knowledge they got a few years ago, and that they passed it on to national armies, or are they, or is UNESCO still retaining this this competence and posing itself as the main leader on this question of heritage in times of armed conflicts? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. So yes, I think that when I was talking about the strategy, it was a text adopted by the intergovernmental bodies of UNESCO, that is to say the UNESCO General Conference and the Executive Council. And the goal of this strategy at that time in 2015, when it was adopted, was to create links with UN peacekeepers and with the humanitarian actor. And the goal was also to, as I showed in the chapter 7, the goal was to broaden the mandate of UNESCO in order to create cooperation with these different types of actors, but also to increase cooperation and centralization within UNESCO, within, for example, the Office of the Director General, but also within this preparedness and response team within the cultural sector. So, and I think it would also answer the second part of your question, which is hopefully, which is on the national army and the will of this national army, especially the UK. The US have been working on cultural heritage for longer, but France and UK, I think there is a very strong incentive now for taking cultural heritage into account because of this momentum, of course. I think it was very important. It is also an issue for France and UK and the US to win hearts and minds. I think it's very the main thing about this army with cultural heritage. The goal now, because they are fighting terrorist group, sometimes it's a counterinsurgency context. The goal is really to win hearts and minds, and cultural heritage protection is a tool for that. And in terms of UNESCO, I think the major role of UNESCO is a coordination role between different networks, the networks of the National Army, the networks of NATO. It's at the center of all this epistemic community of legal advisor, archaeologists, etc., and military also working directly on the ground on this issue. So it's mostly coordination, but because of a lack of budget, UNESCO cannot do that much on the ground, and I really hope in the future there will be stronger mandate for UNESCO on this field. I hope it answered your question, Ella.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for one more question if somebody wants to intervene.
So if not, maybe I'll just make a couple of points. It's really a little bit following up on Yves' point about this is a close focus study for a rather short period of time, but it's tackling an issue which has a huge historical arc behind it, and which can manifest itself not only in the specific form of protection of precious sites from terrorism, but the broader instrumentalization of sites for the purposes of gaining political support, demonstrating the evil of the opponent, and so forth. So in addition to preserving, I mean, you mentioned it with the case of Bamiyan. They can't put the Buddhas back in Bamiyan, but they can turn Bamiyan into a site which is a memorial of their rejection of the terrorism and the barbarism of the people who dynamited it. But once we start thinking of that, we get a wider range of cases. I mean, to give an example close to home, Coventry Cathedral, was bombed in the Second World War, and the question after the war, the critical one was, should we rebuild it, or should we preserve this evidence of the terrible thing that was done to us? I think that's a question which arises with the World Trade Center, for example. So it's not necessarily just, beautiful old exotic structures. That's one thought. In other words, memorialization, the politics of memorialization rather than just of preservation of cultural sites, I think widens out the discussion and casts the dynamics of it in a slightly different light. And then the other respect, which is perhaps looking towards the future, is the question of Islam in all of this. I mean, you may have seen that the Hagia Sophia, which was, a famous Byzantine church, was turned into a mosque under the Ottomans. And then it was turned into a museum in 1934. And last year, Erdogan turned it back into a mosque. There's a lot of, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and what are the ultimate historical truths that we're asserting here. And even more spectacular in India, the whole Modi administration's policy really is about saying the Ayodhya Mosque, I think I have it right, was built on a Hindu site, which was the birthplace of the god Ram. So we must demolish the mosque in order to assert, and of course there's no need for me to talk about the holy site in Jerusalem. So I think that, that one way of building out from what has been done is to widen the comparative politics of this kind of highly charged symbolic political capital, which reveals, once you start doing it that way, that humanity doesn't always have a single unified view about who is good and who is bad in these issues.
Mathilde, you have the last word, but unfortunately I was told that another seminar will soon begin with the same Zoom place. And so 2 minutes perhaps just to conclude.
Okay, yes, just to answer your last comment, I think this is the interest of this issue of humanity. And as I said in the introduction, I think I would conclude on that is that humanity is very interesting because it is an ideological concept, and it's used by various type of actors at different level, different scales, just to show the picture of a unified community. But this unified community is always unified in front of an enemy. And this is why this notion of agonism is so important in my book. It's because you cannot unite, and it's a very old principle in political science, you cannot unite a community without designing an enemy. And this is why there are so much instrumentalization of this notion of humanity. And I think the case of cultural heritage is very symbolic in this perspective. So yeah, there are a lot of views of humanity. There is no single interpretation of and meaning of humanity. And this is what is so interesting also with this kind of rhetoric. So I would, I don't know if it's a real conclusion, but yeah, definitely would open new perspective on this concept, perhaps in my future research. Thank you very much for all attending this session. It was really a pleasure to present my book.
I think it was a good end, at least at the time being, and then we'll go on with the conversation. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending these seminars, and thank you especially Laurence and Mathilde for your discussion. We have to close now the seminar, and we hope to see you again either via Zoom or in presential in a near future. Bye-bye.
Bye.